And I'm back. Alright, so look. So before this video starts, I just quickly have to say two things. Number one, like this video and the video before this one, considering it'll help it do a lot better in the algorithm, as well as go check out the recent Q&A video that I just posted. It has a little face cam in there, a little fun action, something that I usually don't do. So I'd appreciate it if you guys were to go leave a like on there, leave a comment or whatever, right? But ultimately, the last thing that I do need you guys to say, I know I said two, but three things. Turn on all post notifications, seeing as I just realized a lot of you guys don't even get any notifications from me. So yeah, go ahead and do that, and I'll love you forever. That said, let's get started.
Hey Ross, sauce it up.
It would be at this moment that Deku would be just about to crush his hand, and in Gaara-like fashion would splatter the Nomu everywhere, except it wouldn't happen. At the last possible moment, Kurogiri would end up interfering with the process and would end up pretty much using his warp gate portal to get a bunch of villains to come in, and he'd be like, "Get the kid!" Right? Normally, nothing happened because these villains wouldn't be able to touch him, but Izuku is midway about to crush something and he can't really do nothing to stop it, right? So he would put up a barrier of like microbots to stop the villains, but one villain particularly would have a jamming quirk. And what would happen is he would use his jamming quirk right at the moment that the microbots were going to fully crush the Nomu. And as that would happen, Izuku would have to sit there and watch as his attempt at defeating the Nomu would be completely fruitless. Izuku would crush his hand and the Nomu would still screech, break out of the microbots which were being held, and Izuku's like head device that he would use to actually control the microbots would just shatter. This would lead Izuku to then get rushed at by Shigaraki, who, thinking that Izuku without that ability is nothing, would then come in trying to decay him. However, Deku would immediately dodge out of the way, looking at the villains that were about to hit him, and Shigaraki would be just about to decay Deku when suddenly, "I am here," would be heard from the distance, leading to All Might blitzing in, saving Izuku's life, and then he would do even more than that. He then goes in, defeats the Nomu, and afterwards we would have a cleanup session where all of the students would be questioned for all of the events that took place, and eventually they would all be told that they're going to be having a 1-week training break that they could use to do whatever it is they want, but Aizawa would advise them to study up considering they're a bit behind. Izuku and Mei would end up using this time to actually create Baymax. Having been given the idea of creating himself like a little robot buddy, Izuku would finally take up that idea and decides that actually it's a great idea. They would end up having to create on this time Baymax, and not only that, but Izuku would have decided that he wants to implant the technology that he uses with the microbots, like the headset thing. He wants to implant that into a smaller device that could be implanted in on his neck. That way he could control the microbots and even upgrade the microbots to be magnetic so that they can't be lost and they could always return to him, and for them to have elemental properties. That way they can electrocute people, shoot water, and put out fires and shoot fire out themselves. They would develop this project for the entire week, and they would get little to no sleep during this time. But Mei and Hatsume would be together all of the time that they would be developing it, and Mei Hatsume, even though at first she didn't view it like this, her spending as much time with Izuku would lead her to feel something strange. She doesn't know what it is quite yet, but she knows she feels something towards Deku. Not only that, but Deku seemed really worried when he looked at Mei. After the sports festival, the USJ concluded, Izuku was asking about Mei all over. She found it pretty sweet, but she would ultimately say not to worry, nudged him on the shoulder, and then they both immediately got to work on these projects. Eventually, they finally end up finishing these projects, and it would be right on time considering that the UA Sports Festival would be right around the corner. Deku would be more than prepared for this. And it would be at this moment that we cut back to class when everybody would be told about the UA Sports Festival, and Uraraka would go absolutely berserk, being like, "Are you ready?" to everybody. Eventually everybody would be hyped with Uraraka, and eventually class would end, leading to them all making their way outside, only for them to be stopped by everybody who would be looking at them, muttering and going to look at the competition. Eventually Shinso would come in, say his two-piece, and then Deku would walk right by him, wondering to himself what that was about. Eventually though, what would end up happening is that Deku would use his bots to race against Todoroki and Bakugo and everybody else who was part of the sports festival, considering that that's the first event. Obviously the sports festival starts with Midnight being all like announcing the race, and we're just gonna jump to that because I'm pretty sure you guys just care about that. Anyways, the one piece of information that I feel like would definitely be interesting to note would be that when Izuku looks at Midnight, bro feels happy. And that's all I'm gonna say. But pretty much what would end up happening is that Deku would use his microbots to race against everybody. And the second that Todoroki would freeze the floor around him, Izuku would finally show off the new technology he created. His microbots would melt the ice underneath him, and it would immediately pick him up, leading Deku to then using his microbots and making his way across in the same fashion that Todoroki is. However, Todoroki's skating. Izuku would be able to keep up with both of them, and it would be at this moment that Bakugo would decide to play dirty. Shooting a massive explosion at Deku, some of his microbots would get destroyed, and then more would be created instantly, as Izuku's microbots would then come flying right back at him and catch him mid-air as he was about to fall down onto the ground after his line of microbots, which was holding him up, would be broken. But as this would be happening, Izuku would then look towards the finish line. He would create a gigantic hand out of his microbots and throw himself with them. Suddenly, Izuku would then have a bunch of microbots create like a little cushion. As we've seen, microbots are capable of building things like Hiro showed in his demonstration. So they would build like a big mattress thing for Deku to land on, and he would land on it, bounce on it, and pass the finish line just barely, leading then to Bakugo, Todoroki, and everybody else ending up arriving there and being like, "What? How?" And eventually what would pretty much end up happening after this is that we would have the cavalry race. Just like in the original, Deku's team would still consist of Mei Hatsume, Dark Shadow, and Uraraka. And he would think to himself that it would be perfect. And he would use his microbots to create a gigantic dragon, which would fly in the air, and he would have an aerial battle with Todoroki and Bakugo. It'd actually be pretty interesting because Todoroki would shoot himself into the air and his teammates with his ice, and Bakugo would end up flying off from his team using his explosions to stay airborne. The battle wouldn't last long, considering that Izuku's microbots give him a bit of the upper hand and advantage, and Todoroki can't just shoot ice like he does normally when he's standing. This time it has to come out straight from his palm, and he can't exactly shoot gigantic things out of just his hands, right? Not yet quite, or not at least quite yet. And so what would pretty much end up happening here is that we would get a scene in which Todoroki would shoot ice at Deku, Deku using microbots would shatter it midair, and then Bakugo coming flying in will then get smacked away by this gigantic dragon with its tail, only for Bakugo to be caught by his team. And then ultimately Bakugo would be like, "Damn it," as he would lunge back up into the air and would begin trying to face off against the squad. What would pretty much end up happening is that Deku's team would be able to ultimately override this entire thing, and eventually we would end up having Deku's team passing, leading to the next battle, which is ultimately going to be Deku versus Shinso. Just like in the original, Deku would get caught by the ability of Shinso. However, Deku's ability to still have consciousness would lead Deku to still be able to use his microbots, which would easily be able to rush in at Shinso, and right before Deku was about to step out of the arena, they would catch him, put him back on the stadium, and then rush back towards the direction of Shinso, only to just throw him off of the arena, and Shinso would be like, "How?" You know what I mean? As Shinso would ask Deku how in the world he was able to break out of it, or even use his quirk, and Deku would say it's not a quirk, he's quirkless. But the way he was able to do it is because his quote-unquote technology, or quirk as he would call it, is based on his mind. So he basically created technology that allows him the ability to control these little inanimate objects, showing him a single microbot. And he'd say, you know, by itself, it's nothing, but get all of its friends together and they can accomplish a lot of things. It's kind of how people work. You should give it a try, Shinso. Also, I had a buddy of mine warn me about your ability, so I set my microbots to autopilot. Catch you later. As he hops off the stage, and then Deku would just make his way towards Mei. As he would tell Shinso that even though his quirk isn't flashy, he has a lot of potential. Following this, we would then have the Todoroki battle, and the way that I see this going down is essentially Izuku would go over towards Mei, you know, right? We gotta like warm up, you know, we gotta preface this real quick. He goes over towards Mei, and you know, he talks about Mei, and he's talking with her, and he's like, so, you know, how are you feeling about your match? And she's like, honestly, I was originally just gonna let him pass, but I think that maybe I should try to see how far I can actually get during this thing. And Izuku would say, honestly, I think you'd make it extremely far. With your mind, there's no reason you can't be a support, you can't create support items for heroes and be a hero yourself. Plus, who knows better how to use your babies than you? Mei would laugh, smile, pat herself on the shoulder, be like, ah, that's a knee slapper. And then ultimately Deku would make his way outside. She would wish him good luck and she'd say, hey, don't lose. As Deku would smile and she would laugh, as ultimately Deku would make his way towards the stadium, where Todoroki would immediately kick things off by shooting a gigantic geyser of ice at Deku. However, Deku, using his microbots, using the heat part of it, would completely melt the thing, and Todoroki would shoot another ice thing at Deku. However, Deku would continue using his microbots to completely melt the ice. Eventually, a bunch of water would be covering the floor, and Deku, using his microbots, would smile, as, you know, he pretty much just electrocutes the microbots, and he would like get himself far enough in the air to the point where, the microbots themselves don't conduct electricity, but the water that Todoroki was standing on, it does. So when Deku shocks that, it shocks Todoroki, leading Todoroki to be stunned for just long enough for Izuku to create a gigantic like hand holding like a hammer, and it would, oh my bad, I just hit my mic with my my mouse pad. You guys are probably like, how do you do that? But don't worry about it, all right? Just don't worry about it, okay? What pretty much ends up happening is that Deku would just slam Todoroki, and he would send him flying out of the stadium. However, Todoroki would catch himself using his ice, and Deku would be like, nope, as a gigantic hand with microbots would form and smack the ice, like they would shatter it, leading Todoroki's ice not to be able to hold him up anymore, and Todoroki would ultimately fall onto the grass, leading Todoroki to be like, can't believe I lost. And ultimately, Endeavor would be like, Shoto! From the stage, right? As Todoroki would think to himself, whatever, you know, at least he didn't make him look good. Following this, Bakugo and Deku would finally end up having their battle. And it would actually be a little bit of a longer battle in which Deku would ultimately winning. Bakugo, because of the fact that he had kind of always hung out with Deku, kind of understands how Deku thinks. And Bakugo would have decided that ultimately he can't beat Deku close range because those microbots will definitely get in the way. Just like of what would have happened versus the Heroes versus Villain event, he's not going to be willing to risk it. So instead what Bakugo would do is let Deku use his microbots, and he would just fly up into the air as high as he possibly can, trying to see where the limit of his microbots are. Kind of like Baymax would have done in the Big Hero 6 movie. And Bakugo would fly up very high to the point where oxygen would be very thin, leading Bakugo's strategy not to really work. And Deku, once his microbots would grab a hold of Bakugo, it would grab onto his leg and drag him back down to earth, only to encase him in a thick amount of microbots, and Bakugo would shoot explosion after explosion after explosion. But there's just so many microbots that they would keep self-healing the cocoon that Deku would hold Bakugo in, and eventually Deku would say, hey. As from here, the electricity would pretty much end up shocking Bakugo into unconsciousness, and Deku would win the battle. Since it's not an enclosed area, Bakugo's defeat would be a lot easier than it would be had this been like an enclosed area where Bakugo could just shoot explosions and spam them, you know what I mean? Bakugo after this would have a bit of a anger outburst and talk about the past, about how, you know, like he was supposed to be better, and how, you know, as friends, he never expected this to happen. Like, what's going on? You know what I mean? Like, he's just so confused. And Deku would talk to him and be like, don't worry. Like, you know, just because of this doesn't mean I'm better than you. You know what I mean? Like, your quirk isn't phenomenal. To be told, if I had a quirk like yours, I'd probably make it to #1 hero. So trust me, Bakugo, you can still get there. And eventually, Bakugo and Deku would kind of end up having like a little bit of a makeup session where they both kind of like they make up after everything that's happened and how awkward things have been for a bit, considering Deku stopped talking to him and Bakugo was wondering what was up with that. He was kind of angry at Deku because of that, but ultimately now they're friends again. And Deku from here would end up working on Baymax even longer. Deku would ultimately end up taking Baymax and going off to train with Gran Torino for plot's sake, because that's the person that he's going to be picking when it comes to the Stain arc and the hero stuff and all that stuff. And we're just going to be saying that it's because All Might would suggest him to go there, saying that even though he knows he wants to stay quirkless, there's somebody who he could probably be getting a lot of valuable information from, right? And ultimately, what would pretty much end up happening is that we would end up having a moment in which Gran Torino would try to prank Deku. However, Deku, being a lot smarter than the original Deku, would dip his hand into the blood, so-called blood, and seeing as it doesn't look like there's any visible wounds, as soon as he like dabs his finger in it, he realizes immediately what this was. He's like, ketchup? Seriously? What kind of a prank is this? As Gran Torino would wake up and using his jet quirk would begin to bounce around the entirety of his room, leading to Deku just watching and ultimately using his microbots to form a shield around himself. Gran Torino would be like destroying it over and over. However, he realizes that he can't quite hit Deku because it just keeps healing. So eventually Gran Torino would say, looks like I can't use the same strategy I used with All Might on you, kid. And Deku would say, I'm not going to let you beat me into submission. I'm not like all the other people who have almost infinite stamina and durability. I'm not like All Might. I have no quirk. And Gran Torino says, I know, kid. Doesn't mean I can't toughen you up, though. And Deku would say, look, you can teach me anything else. Maybe how to run an agency. You ever had something like that? And Gran Torino would say, not quite, kid. But for now, you can clean up the mess you made. As Deku would be like, dude, what are you talking about? You made the mess. And Gran Torino would be like, huh? As Deku would be like, whatever. And using his microbots would immediately clean up the mess in like an instant. Following this, 2 days would pass where Deku would wonder to himself why in the world he picked Gran Torino. But eventually, the reason would become very clear. To save Tenya Ida. Because on the day that they would end up making their way towards Hosu City, a gigantic Nomu would come flying at the bus that they were in, or train, sorry, destroying that, leading Gran Torino to shoot out using his jet quirk, and Deku making his way towards Hosu City, where Deku would hear a blood-curdling scream, get it, cause Stain, and ultimately would make his way there. Once arriving, Deku would end up clicking a button which would cause Baymax to come shooting away all the way over there, and once Baymax would arrive, just this big marshmallow would be right next to Deku. As Deku would look at the direction of Stain, see that he was just about to stab him fatally, and Deku using his microbots would shoot them at Stain's direction, leading Stain to be flown back, and ultimately would crash into like a garbage can, right? This would eventually lead to Baymax then turning towards Ida, slowly turning towards him and being like, rate your pain on a scale of 1 to 10. And Ida can't move considering that Stain's using his quirk on him, but ultimately, Deku would then turn towards Ida and say, just answer the question when you can move. Baymax, 10 to hero native as well. And eventually Deku would turn back, only to see Stain was coming at him full bloodlust at this time, and Deku using his microbots would catch him mid-air, slamming him into the wall, as Deku would then pick up Stain once more, slam him into the other wall, grab his swords and not even let Stain get close to him. I know a lot of you guys would probably have been thinking that this was because like that this was gonna be like some cool fight, but no. Stain quite literally just has to be one of the worst opponents for Deku. He doesn't have no powerful offensive moves. He's more of like a very, very close range fighter, and without cutting you, he's really not that much of a threat because he's just superhuman level. So Deku's microbots would easily be able to piece up Stain, and ultimately what would pretty much end up happening is we would find ourselves in the final exam portion of the story. Once they all end up arriving, They end up having a little test just to see how much they improved, and Deku would even have a bit of a moment with Ida, telling him not to go all crazy and haywire again and to use his logical side. Isn't Ida supposed to be some sort of brainiac or something like that? Come on, dude, think before you do things, he would say. And Ida would bow down, being like, I apologize for my actions. I understand now that I was wrong in trying to get revenge. It wasn't very heroic. And Deku would say, you could say that again. But whatever. Look, now we made it this far, so let's not fail. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. And ultimately the final exams day would come. Considering that Deku's in the general course, he has to take 2 types of final exams. The normal one and the general course one. The general course one, he has to bring in a project. And Izuku and Mei would have been paired up as teammates, and their project would be Baymax. They present him to the class, and let's just say that the class loves him. However, somebody would suggest the idea of having Baymax be a fighter. And Deku, honestly, he loves the idea. That same night, he would program a bunch of fighting protocols into Baymax, and considering this, Baymax would now be the same one that we would get in canon. Deku this time would get a suit kind of similar to the one that Hero has, but a bit different, more My Hero Academia style, more modern and less like bulky like the one that Hero has, you know what I mean? Like way more techy, if that makes sense. But what would pretty much end up happening following this is that Deku would be paired up with Bakugo to face off against All Might for his final test. And Deku, using his microbots paired with Bakugo's explosions and Deku's incredible mind, would have been able to formulate a plan which would have easily taken care of All Might. All Might would have been baited by Bakugo, who would be used as a distraction, falling into a trap that Deku would have created using his microbots, and as soon as that would happen, All Might would then proceed to get electrocuted, frozen, and lit ablaze by Izuku's microbots. All Might being taken out in that moment, and this would lead Izuku and Bakugo to run away, making their grand old escape, and Bakugo to say that if it would have been up to him, he would have definitely just fought All Might head to head. And Izuku would say, honestly, Bakugo, you're strong, but he would have torn you to pieces. And Bakugo would say someday he won't be able to. But Deku saying that, honestly, if he was to use certain things, like and add certain things to his costume, it would make him 2 times stronger. And Bakugo would be like, what do you mean, Deku? As Deku would tell him what his ideas are. And Bakugo would think about it, thinking to himself that he's kind of right. This whole time he's been thinking about things wrong, wanting to do everything himself, thinking that he has to do things that way, but if he was to use the Brainiac's mind, maybe he could even take a shortcut to becoming stronger. And eventually what would end up happening is that Deku and Bakugo would build an even slightly better relationship than they would have had in the original, and ultimately what would pretty much end up happening after this is that Deku would end up getting very, very much so ready for the Forest Training Camp arc. Now, just like in the original, we would have the scene where Shigaraki arrives and he like taps on Deku's neck and he like holds him and he's like, why in the world is it that you were able to almost defeat my Nomu, kid? I figured that if I take you out, then maybe the problem for killing All Might would have been a lot easier. You weaken the Nomu, and for that you die. As he would be stopped in his tracks, and Izuku, using his microbots, would grab on a Shigaraki before he could even do anything to him, and Shigaraki would get flung into an ice cream stand. Shigaraki would feel all the different ice creams just bounce on his body, and Izuku would say, well, that's a flavorful fall. As from here, Shigaraki gets up angry and would immediately, like, realizing now that he caused a big scene and that a bunch of like officers and heroes are now going to be alerted, Shigaraki immediately just dips for the hills. And Deku would say that it's fine. It is what it is. He would let him go. Eventually though, Uraraka, Meihatsume, and all of them would end up arriving, and they would ask Deku what happened. Meihatsume having gone to the bathroom, and Deku saying that their old buddy Shigaraki attacked him, but it's no big deal. He was weak anyways. Everybody would kind of laugh at the fact that Deku just called one of the villains that attacked them weak, but ultimately they continue on with their days, and eventually we would find ourselves in the scene where Deku and everybody else, including the students, would be on the bus, just kind of playing little road games and all that kind of stuff. And eventually what would pretty much end up going down is that Deku and all of them would end up arriving at the Forest Training Camp. Once there, they end up realizing, Aizawa, we're not quite there yet. The camp is over there. Why did we stop here? They'd all be talking amongst themselves, and Aizawa would be talking with Mandalay, being like, oh yeah, your idea is great. Suddenly, Mineta would say, can we get back on the bus? And Aizawa would say, no. As from here, they would all immediately try their best to make their way onto the bus in any way possible, but Mandalay would throw them off of the cliff using her mud powers, and then she would scream down, oh, and don't worry, there's gonna be a bunch of little friends there that are gonna guide you through the forest, alright? Catch you later! Hopefully you make it there by the time that supper starts. And they would all turn around only to see a bunch of gigantic mud monsters. And Izuku would say, well, let's get started.